Answered in Kind. 54. Philosopher's bane, and the weapons we use on ourselves. There is a peculiar spectacle that unfolds whenever a human being first approaches the threshold of thought and mistakes the threshold for the summit. The air is thin there. The ego, unacclimated to altitude, panics. It reaches for oxygen in the form of dismissal, caricature, superiority. It has not yet learned that philosophy is not a performance of hauteur, but a slow, exacting apprenticeship to reality. And so the novice, still budding, still tender in the musculature of discernment, often discovers the intoxicant of disdain before discovering the discipline of inquiry. Dismissal feels like power. Contempt feels like clarity. Ridicule masquerades as refinement. But these are tremors of insecurity, not tremors of genius. We must begin here. Shame is not medicine. It is not antiseptic. It is not a scalpel. It is a constrictor. It narrows breath, narrows posture, narrows cognition. It induces compliance through humiliation, not transformation through illumination. A shamed mind does not awaken. It contracts, it secretes, it fragments. And yet, entire cultures have canonized shame as virtue. It has been institutionalized, ritualized, sanctified. In certain theological corridors, shame is paraded as righteousness. In certain educational architectures, humiliation is mistaken for instruction. In certain social hierarchies, guilt is deployed as currency. The result is a civilization of people wielding interior weapons against themselves, believing this self-laceration to be moral hygiene. But shame does not purify. It freezes. A person taught to shame themselves becomes exquisitely sensitive to perceived embarrassment. They scan the environment for impropriety. They flinch at deviation. They police authenticity. Not because authenticity is dangerous, but because authenticity exposes the places within them that were never permitted to breathe. Projection, then, is not merely accusation. It is confession displaced. It is the psyche announcing, here lies an unexamined wound, but pointing elsewhere while speaking. When someone radiates internal conflict, it is visible to those who have done even a modicum of shadow integration. The micro-expressions betray it. The jaw sets. The breath becomes shallow. The words sharpen while the nervous system trembles. There is a plaster mask, carefully painted, intellectually varnished. But the fissures are audible if you listen for the subtle ring beneath the rhetoric. Shadow work is not aesthetic. It is not a social media ornament. It is the methodical descent into the dim corridors of one's own repressed shame, pain, fear, and guilt. The unlabeled chambers of the psyche, where disowned impulses ferment. To undertake this work requires fortitude, To refuse it requires projection. And when projection meets someone who is not ashamed, something fascinating occurs. The shamed psyche expects reciprocity. It expects flinching. It expects defensiveness. It expects escalation. It expects the other to tremble in harmony with its own tremor. When that resonance does not occur, when composure remains intact, the projector encounters a void where they expected resistance, and that void is destabilizing. But if the other does not feel embarrassed, then what becomes of the accusation? One cannot force another to experience humiliation. One can only attempt to transmit it. And if the transmission fails, the energy has nowhere to land. It ricochets. It reveals itself. This is why composure is revolutionary. To refrain from absorbing another's projection is not coldness, it is hygiene. To refuse shame is not arrogance, it is sovereignty. To decline the blame game is not evasion, it is maturity. The blame game is an infinite regress. Who began it? Parents, their parents, teachers, institutions. Epigenetic residues encoded in stress responses and inherited anxieties. The lineage of humiliation is ancient. One can trace it back indefinitely and never find its origin. To keep score is to perpetuate it. To burn the scorecard is to interrupt it. Burn the scorecard. It does not serve you. Because scorekeeping masquerades as justice while secretly preserving resentment. Now consider obedience. Obedience is often conflated with virtue. But obedience to what? To inherited scripts? To institutionalized shame? To gendered caricatures that confuse biological traits with leadership capacity? We are told that leadership is anatomical, that authority is hormonal, that dominance is destiny. And so we shame those who do not conform to these mythologies. Men who do not posture are diminished. Women who do not shrink are chastised. Entire human potentials are suffocated beneath archaic dogma. This is not philosophy. This is fear architecture. And fear, when unexamined, builds nooks and crannies within a life, small enclosures of safety, narrow corridors of permissible action. People live decades within these enclosures, never attempting what they secretly long for, because one microscopic idea implanted long ago governs their perimeter. Do not embarrass yourself. Embarrass yourself in whose eyes? The eyes that tremble when seen clearly. It is astonishing how often shamelessness is mistaken for sanctity. We elevate those who appear impervious, assuming their immunity to shame indicates moral superiority. But the absence of visible shame is not proof of integration. It may be proof of dissociation, and the presence of shame is not proof of humility. It may be proof of internalized violence. The question is not who feels shame. The question is, who is ruled by it? There is a profound asymmetry between a person who feels compelled by shame and one who does not. The former experiences constant micro-threats to identity. The latter experiences spaciousness. When they meet, the tension is palpable. One constricts, the other remains open. One seeks to regulate the other's expression. The other sees no need to regulate at all. Which one holds power? Power, in this context, is not dominance. It is nervous system sovereignty. It is the refusal to tremble merely because another trembles. It is the capacity to witness another's dysregulation without internalizing it. This requires discernment, because one must also recognize one's own capacity to wound. Precision matters. Humor can cross thresholds. Words can cut. Boundaries exist, and they deserve reverence. The mark of maturity is not shamelessness without conscience, but shamelessness paired with responsibility. If one recognizing having crossed a line, one corrects course, not from humiliation, but from integrity. Integrity is a subtler compass than shame. Shame says, collapse. Integrity says, adjust. We do not teach this. We teach performance. We teach compliance. We teach reputational anxiety. We do not teach self-mastery. Self-mastery is the art of governing one's own projections before attempting to critique the world. It is the discipline of noticing when one's accusation is confession. It is the courage to ask, why does this disturb me? Instead of declaring, this is disturbing. It is easier to shame than to inquire. Shame is swift. Inquiry is slow. Shame feels decisive. Inquiry feels vulnerable. And so many prefer the former. But consider the neurological cost. Chronic shame dysregulates the autonomic nervous system. It entrenches hypervigilance. It amplifies cortisol cascades. It wires the brain toward avoidance. Over time, this becomes personality. A life organized around not being seen. A voice modulated to avoid reproach. A creativity fenced off with no discernible exit. All because someone once learned to wield a weapon inwardly. You do not need to hold another's embarrassment for them. You are not required to contort yourself because someone else experiences discomfort in your presence. Their nervous system is their jurisdiction. Your responsibility is your own alignment. If someone chooses to watch, to listen, to engage, that choice carries experiential consequences. They are not obligated to enjoy what they encounter, but neither are you obligated to shrink because they do not. Autonomy cuts both ways. Now, what of apology? It has become both scarce and manipulative. Some refuse it out of pride. Others deploy it as strategy. True apology emerges from integrity, not humiliation. It says, I misstepped. It does not say, I am worthless. The distinction is enormous. A culture that cannot distinguish between guilt and responsibility will oscillate between denial and self-flagellation. But a culture that learns self-mastery will produce individuals who can encounter projection without retaliation, encounter shame without submission, encounter accusation without collapse. The eyes reveal this. When someone is seen too clearly, they often experience it as intrusion, as though their interior space has been opened without permission. This discomfort is not caused by the seer. It is caused by the unexamined contents. And if one has not yet sorted those contents, the impulse is to slam the door shut, perhaps by accusing the observer of impropriety. Yet, seeing is not aggression, it is awareness. To be unashamed is not to be reckless. It is to have metabolized one's own shadow sufficiently that external accusation finds no purchase. It is to have walked the dim corridors voluntarily, illuminated them, and found nothing there that necessitates concealment. Such a person does not need to dominate. They do not need to humiliate. They do not need to keep score. They can leave a trembling conversation without trembling themselves. They can recognize when only one nervous system in the room knows better and quietly take responsibility for de-escalation. This is strength, not loudness, not superiority, not rhetorical acrobatics. Strength is the refusal to internalize weapons you were taught to use on yourself. The radiant irony is this: when you no longer shame yourself, you cease needing to shame others. When you no longer collapse under accusation, you cease needing to accuse. When you burn the scorecard, you liberate not only yourself, but the field around you. The plaster masks will always slip. Projection cannot sustain itself indefinitely in the presence of unreactive clarity. Eventually, one either integrates or retreats. That is not yours to force. Shadow work cannot be coerced, but you can model it. You can stand unashamed without being cruel. You can respect boundaries without abandoning your own expression. You can decline the blame game without denying history. You can acknowledge epigenetic inheritance without surrendering to it. And in doing so, you become a subtle invitation, not to humiliation, not to obedience, but to sovereignty. A sovereignty that recognizes shame and guilt as dangerous instruments, not toys, and chooses instead the scalpel of discernment, the antiseptic of awareness, the steady hand of composure. When a shame-filled one stands before one who feels no shame, the true question is not who appears powerful. The true question is, who is free? And freedom, luminous, disciplined, unflinching freedom, does not need to embarrass anyone to exist.